On today's show, we dive into the mailbag in early to mid-June as we are less than 2 weeks away from the NBA draft. Plenty to get to on the free agency standpoints, trade rumors, draft stuff, player evaluations, odd questions here and there, all that and much more coming up on today's podcast.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1257 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Friday evening, June 10th. And today's show is packed with mailbag questions and answers from me. I've not been solo in a while, so hopefully you guys have all been enjoying the guests. I would say the parade of guests that have been coming through on the podcast. And also, please subscribe to this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, as well as YouTube on the video side. If you have an audio-only subscription, I definitely thank you for that as well. But it doesn't take you much time to subscribe on YouTube as well. That's a very nice crossover kind of thing to support the podcast. But we've had all kinds of episodes recently about the NBA draft, about the players on the Hawks roster, about trade stuff, etc. And long guest list that includes Jake Rosen. And by the way, that's a two-part episode that I dropped with Jake on Wednesday and Thursday to rave reviews. Jake is very smart. That was a fun conversation and covers a lot of ground on the NBA draft. We've had player capsules with Glenn Willis, Peachtree Hoops. It's done me a huge favor talking about a lot of guys on the roster. That's been up and down in this space. Ben Pfeiffer, Ricky O'Donnell, Tyler Jones, Robbie Cowland, Andrew Kelly, Ben Ladner, Mark Schindler. The list goes on. All kinds of fun guests in the last month or two since the Hawks season ended, and wall-to-wall coverage continues in this space as the draft is coming very soon. As I record this, 13 days away from the draft, and also that kind of is an unceremonious way to kick off the offseason in general, with trade stuff kind of opening up before that, and then it's kind of a rampage from there until mid to late July. So plenty to get to on the podcast. At any rate, today's pod will be mailbag questions. I'm sort of going to combine some, talk about some of the, I'm not even saying they're going to be news, but sort of rumblings, people asking me. A lot of these, especially early on in the podcast, were like dual questions. I got lots of questions about certain guys that I'm going to touch on briefly here on the show, but we'll get into some other stuff later on about Okongwu and Bogdanovich, etc. So thanks for listening to the podcast, and here we go. First question was actually from a lot of people, but I took one from Greg, who says the following. I can't remember where, but I saw a headline about the Hawks really trying to move John Collins. How likely is that to actually happen? So there's nothing hugely new here with regard to Collins. I talked about Collins at length as a player with Glenn Willis earlier in the offseason, but the rumblings are out there. The chatter has been out there for John for the last couple of years, on and off, about him being a trade candidate. Obviously, he's been paid now by the Hawks. He's making a lot of money, but I think it's still appropriately paid, which is important to keep in mind. He's not super cheap anymore, but certainly a guy who's not on a bad contract by any means. But there's a smoke out there for sure about the Hawks being a little bit more eager this time around to move Collins than they have been in the past. And that kind of jives with the understanding from the top down that the Hawks want to do something different going into next year. I'm pretty high on Collins. If you're a new listener on the show, I'll just say that out loud. I'm not quite as high as Tyler Jones is, friend of the podcast, but I'm definitely on the higher side about Collins. I think he's a good player. He's a very versatile player. He's an improved defender at this point in time. Good offensive player, obviously, finishing around the rim, elite there, and then a good shooter from the perimeter, et cetera, et cetera. But in my understanding, definitely a couple times the last couple of years, it's been reasonably close to moving on from Collins, both in free agency and then obviously now via trade. I've been asking around in the wake of some discussions about Jake Fisher and others about Collins. I think that's probably where the question came from. I saw some aggregation about Jake's comments on Nate Duncan's podcast, which actually happened like 9 days ago. But Jake they were pretty just candid talking about it. And he thinks that Collins has been shopped around a little bit. And I totally understand that. I would say that there's some conflicting messages out there with regard to what I'm hearing about Collins. Certainly, even behind the scenes, off the record stuff, like about just how urgent the Hawks are. Obviously, he is available. I want to stress that. Everyone on the roster outside of Trae Young is available, and Collins might be a little bit more available than other guys at this point in time. I still think that it's not quite as urgent as some want to paint it when it comes to that, but there's stuff out there about Tony Ressler, of course, making some big moves, etc. There is a rumbling out there from Portland in particular. There's been reporting, of course, on Sacramento wanting to trade the number 4 pick for a more present-facing player, which I talked about a lot with Andrew Kelly on the show recently. But also, Portland has a number 7 overall pick, and they're looking for a similar move to kind of move that for a more established piece, and Collins has been rumored as a potential guy there. That number 7 pick would definitely have the appeal to it. I would just say I'm not super high on that draft range in this class. I don't think you're likely to get a star level prospect number 7 in this draft. It's obviously a valuable pick in a lot of ways. It's a mid lottery pick, but there's no a game changer there for me. Maybe AJ Griffin, if you were to slide there, would be interesting, number 7 or overall. But in a vacuum, I think it's pretty unlikely. At least I would definitely take, in terms of if you just compare Collins current value versus the potential upside of number seven overall pick, I should say. I think it is more often than not going to be where Collins is better than that player. But obviously, there's the team control aspect. There's the cheap in terms of rookie contract aspect. You're getting a little bit younger. And there's the upside beyond that, if you want to look at it that way. They have some matching salary. Portland does with Eric Bledsoe, who's more like a Gallo-style non-guarantee matching kind of guy. And then they also have like Josh Hart, who's actually a really good player the Hawks should be interested in. Now, I don't think the Hawks are going to get both number 7 and Josh Hart for John Collins. I would like that in terms of a value, but I think in general, I think Hart is a pretty good value, and the number 7 pick has a lot of value. So I'm not sure where that lands, but I think that's definitely out there. With regard to Collins overall, just to answer the question one more time, I think it's decently likely for that to happen. I'm not rooting for it to happen. I think there's definitely a good chance he comes back as well. It's for me, the way I've been answering this in the last couple of podcasts and on other shows, et cetera, is that there's nobody on the roster that I would bet on being traded individually. I think that there are lots of guys who could be traded and have like a pretty decent chance of being traded. But I think Collins might be on the higher side of this list. But most of these guys are like within like the 30 to 40% range of whether they'll be traded or not. It does seem like there's a lot of buzz on Collins. I'll just say that out loud, but I think that he's had that before and then not ended up being traded, and the Hawks do value him. Obviously, they're not going to give him away for nothing. There could be an interesting move there, but I will just remind you before we move on here, I won't go crazy deep on this, that with Gallo probably not coming back for the Hawks don't have anything behind him at the 4. So anytime you move Collins in the next couple of weeks and months, you have to have a solution at the 4. And obviously, this is a multi-tier process. Not only every move is going to be like perfect in a vacuum, but I think in general, especially let's just say if you had to do the Collins for number 7 overall draft pick hypothetical, you need to have a plan B at the 4, because no matter what happens, nothing you're getting in the draft this year is going to help you win at that level that Collins can help you win right now. And obviously, Ressler and company want to win in the short term. So all that said, he could be moved. It wouldn't shock me, but nothing is set in stone at this point in time. Next thing I want to get to, got a lot of questions about Jeremy Grant coming. I'm not even going to pull a question. There was lots of questions about Jeremy Grant because Mark Stein talked about Jeremy Grant in his newsletter this week, as well as other people. I've heard a lot of people on Grant and also behind the scenes. The Hawks have been interested for a couple times about Jeremy Grant in the last year plus. I heard the other day from an interesting place that the Hawks were offering potentially someone like Bogdanovich and their pick this year. So like a mid-first round pick and bogey for Jeremy Grant, and Detroit wasn't like jumping all over that or anything like that. That's a pretty reasonable hypothetical. I'm not sure if it's 100% true, but it's just one of those things that you hear behind the scenes. I will say I'm not over the moon about Grant, largely because of what he apparently wants in an extension. All indications are that he's going to want to be paid heavily, and he got a big deal from the Pistons, but now he's extension eligible, and he could sign up for up in 4 years, like $110 million. I would not want to give him that contract. I think he's a good player now. That's probably worth that money in year 1 or 2 of that deal. But by the end of that, at age like 32, 33, he probably is going to be slowing down a little bit. He's 28 now. That's totally fine. He's in his prime, but I think Grant is a perfectly solid to good starter, but not a guy who's going to like change your franchise necessarily. He would be better than what the Hawks have. I will say that. If you view Grant as a 3, he is notably better than Hunter right now. Obviously, Hunter long-term could be better. That's definitely still on the table in my mind. But if you were to upgrade from, let's just say, bogey to Grant and kind of slot Herter at the 2, and then you kind of go from there, that probably makes you better in the short term. Obviously, bogey gives you a lot of shooting stuff that Grant doesn't want to give you, but he's a good scorer, good secondary guy. He'd be their best sort of creator in terms of like for his own shot that they have on the roster other than Trey. And then defensively, he is pretty strong as well. Not an elite defender. I think he's probably a little bit overrated in some circles, but he's a pretty good player overall and definitely worth that money now. But obviously, an interesting hypothetical. I wouldn't go crazy. Like some of the asking prices on Grant that have been out there, like 2 first-round picks, I wouldn't want to do that. I think one of those guys on the Hawks roster, and really it kind of has to be someone like Herter or Bogey for money reasons. One of those guys plus a pick for Grant is like a reasonable trade. I'm not saying they have to make that. I would not trade Collins for Jeremy Grant. I've been on record about that for a year plus now. I think Collins is just a better player than Grant. He's also younger, and I think will be on a better contract moving forward. So I would not trade Collins for Grant flat out. If it's Grant with something else for Collins, that becomes more interesting. But if it's just Collins for Grant, no thanks. If it's someone like Bogey or Herter plus a pick for Grant, that's more interesting in my opinion. Okay, before we get to the rest of the rumblings and some more mailbag questions, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information this year and always. Find all the latest odds, news, sports developments, including this year's NBA playoffs, which are still ongoing right now with the NBA Finals happening as we speak. MLB scores and odds and lines, all that fun stuff. They have fights, even future bets on next season's NFL, college football, college basketball, next season's NBA, next season's NHL, etc. That's all available at BetOnline, and they're the continuous source for all wagering information. They have live betting, they have esports, they have all the playoff action you want, and much more. And beyond that, BetOnline has all the other sports that you might enjoy wagering on. That includes golf and tennis, auto racing, horse racing. They have hockey, of course, soccer, cricket, entertainment bets, and any sport you can think of. And beyond that, they have poker, casino games, and every other offering that you might enjoy in the wagering space. Head to BetOnline right now today, or your computer or use your mobile device to learn more about all the trends and the action at BetOnline. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, some more rumblings before we get to see the other questions that are in the mailbag on today's show. There's some Rudy Gobert stuff out there from Jake Fisher and KOC over at The Ringer and Tony Jones at The Athletic. There was a crossover discussion between Tony Jones and Chris Kirschner that got a lot of attention from Hawks fans, as they probably would notably happen. Obviously, nothing really new here on Gobert. That's been out there for a while. The Hawks got some interest there. He's definitely available-ish from Utah, and nothing, I would say, rising to the level of actual rumor at this point in time. I thought it was notable that Tony Jones, who covers the Jazz every day, thought the Jazz would be asking for a Collins plus Hunter package, plus a first-round pick, and maybe Jalen Johnson as well for Rudy Gobert. I would not do that if I was the Hawks. Now, Gobert is really good. We talked about that a lot in the recent past, both with Andrew and by myself. I'm not going to relitigate that entire thing, but Gobert is good. He's a better player than Capella, but he's also on a massive contract that I think is going to end badly. He's also older than you would want. So there's some pluses and minuses to any Gobert pursuit. Just as a reminder, he is a good player, but that is a deal that is probably not going to be good at the end. I think it's like 4 years, $160+ million for a guy who's already in his late 20s. And is obviously a little bit limited in some respects, but obviously an awesome defender, one of the best in the league, about the best in the league. I'm also on record also of saying that if the Hawks were to trade for someone like Gobert or DeAndre Ayton, they kind of have to have plans for Capella and Okongwu. Obviously, that Tony Jones hypothetical did not have Capella in it. I think that any deal to send to send Gobert to the Hawks would kind of have to have Capella in it somewhere. And even then, I would go as far as to say I'd have a hard time bringing Okongwu back if you were to invest what it would actually take to get Gobert or Ayton. Not because of Okongwu, but just because, like, if you do that, you have to play those guys 32+ minutes per game, and you're kind of just capping what Okongwu can give you. So there's some value in looking to at least trade him if that were to happen. So I don't want to go crazy on this, but obviously I've seen all of that. People ask if I'd seen it. Yes, I've seen all of it. Not a whole lot new there. I think you're basically handing Rudy Gobert the starting center job for as long as he is here. And obviously he's a really good player. He would change your team and make them better in the short term, especially as I like Capella quite a bit. Gobert is a better player, but I think that's not exactly the highest ceiling move in the world to me. So there are pluses and minuses if it happens. If we get a real rumor, I'll probably break down even more, but that's kind of where I am on Gobert at this point in time. And the last bit of rumblings that I was asked about in the coming days, in the recent days, was a report from Matt Moore of the Action Network, friend of the podcast. Love Matt. He wrote this week that multiple league sources have indicated that calls centered around DeAndre Hunter have been steered by the Hawks toward Bogdanovich and Kevin Huerter instead. Now, this is not surprising to me, but people were kind of just making sure that I saw it. Look, I've been saying it for a while. As much as I think that Hunter did not play well this year in a lot of ways, I still think he's going to be a good player, and the Hawks still value him. Now, is it the same as it was a year ago, 2 years ago? I'm not 100% sure. They might have a little bit less value on him now than they had then internally, but make no mistake, they still believe in DeAndre Hunter. That is on the table. This is a good reminder of that. They do not want to trade Hunter in the same sort of tier of guys like your Bogies and Huerters. So while I would argue that Bogey and Huerter are both better players today than Hunter is, Hunter still has that pedigree internally, and the Hawks moved a lot to get him, of course, in the draft. Probably overpaid to get him, of course, in the draft. But it's interesting reporting there from Matt, and I think I've heard the same. Like, they still value Hunter. I think Hunter is in that tier with a Okongwu of guys they don't really want to trade, and that doesn't mean they won't. But certainly, I would certainly echo what Matt had to report about Hunter versus Bogey and Huerter. They'd rather trade those guys than trade Hunter. Okay. I got a question now. We'll sort of dive into the actual direct mailbag questions before we move on to other things. So this one comes from, I'm looking at the name now. There it is. It's Clint. I'm not sure if that's a Clint Capella account or what, so my apologies, but it might be someone named Clint. So there you go. The question is, what do you take from which players the Hawks have had in for workouts for the draft? Would they draft someone at 16 that has not been in Atlanta for a workout? And I guess the question is how much they actually matter. So good opportunity here to kind of just list off the players the Hawks have actually had in town for a publicly announced workout. And we'll come back to this later on. But the list is very, very long of like every single player. They're all like these 6-player workouts. So like it's like 100+ guys. But the guys who are like potential top 20-ish picks, and I want to say that I don't have all these guys in my top 20, but still Marjon Beauchamp, Malachi Branham, Christian Brown, Kendall Brown, Kennedy Chandler, Tyree Eason, Jaden Hardy, Trevor Keels, EJ Liddell, Bryce McGowans, and Blake Wesley. That's 11 guys who I think could reasonably be selected in the top 20 that have been in for an interview or a workout in Atlanta. I would stress again that a lot of guys who are projected to go in the top, 12 to 13 just won't come, even if they offer a workout to a guy that's like, let's just say Johnny Davis. If you're Johnny Davis and I think there's a reasonable chance, a small one, but a reasonable one, that he could fall to 16. But his projection, he's in the green room for the NBA draft. Usually those guys are not going to want to come work out for a team that has the number 16 overall pick. So keep that in mind. The Hawks can't just summon anybody they want. So guys have to agree to come to the workout in Atlanta. And furthermore, beyond that, this is actually kind of important. There is nothing at all from the Hawks sort of prevents the Hawks that actually want to have a workout with a guy and not announce it. In fact, they do this all the time, especially individual settings. They will not just announce every workout. I know for an absolute fact that they have held individual workouts in previous draft cycles and not announced them. And that's totally fine. I've been covering the team for a long time. Before Travis Schlenk, in the Budenholzer era and the Danny Ferry era before that, the Hawks just never announced draft workouts. Like, the Hawks make it pretty easy on you now. They open them up. They send out releases as to who's coming to town. It was like pulling teeth to get information on workouts in the Ferry Budenholzer era. So all teams do this stuff differently. But I will tell you, the Hawks have drafted guys in the last 5, 6, 7 years that were not in Atlanta for workouts for the draft. It's totally fine. Or drafted guys that only came in for individual workouts and were never announced. That's also fine as well. So keep that all in mind. And as far as the question is concerned, you shouldn't make too much of anything about just the Hawks bringing a guy in. I saw every time I tweet out a list of guys who's coming, I see some celebrations or some disdain or whatever. I think just a good example is Kennedy Chandler, who was a guy I like actually, but I cannot imagine the Hawks taking Kennedy Chandler, who, just for the record, if you're not a draft person, is a 6-foot point guard only player from Tennessee. There's just no way in my mind the Hawks take that guy 16 overall. And I like him. I think if I was a different team at 16 overall, I would consider Kennedy Chandler. But for the Hawks, he can't play with Trey. You drafted Sharif a year ago. That you just don't need to do that at all. So, but the Hawks worked him out because it's due diligence. Why wouldn't you do that? If the Hawks were to move down, trade down, or buy an early second round pick or something like that, and he slips there's reasons to work out anybody. In fact, the Hawks pretty much work out anybody they can. And that's what most teams do. But generally speaking, the other part of the question was that, like, kind of whether the Hawks would draft someone at 16 that they actually didn't work out. And the answer is definitely yes to that. In fact, again, like it's happened before. I think the biggest reason why that might happen would be if the guy slipped a little bit. Let's use the Johnny Davis example or the Dyson Daniels example, something like that. A guy who was projected to go in the top 10 or 12 that just kind of slides on accident or whatever. Maybe that guy didn't come for a workout. A year ago, Jalen Johnson, I would have told you, was pretty unlikely to get to 20, and it happened. So that's probably the most likely scenario of a guy not working out for the Hawks and also getting to the Hawks and having them draft him at 16. The big thing is the medicals. And generally speaking, a team can get a medical report from an agent or somebody, another team, whatever. So, that's the biggest thing about workouts. I think they're often overvalued when it comes to actual in-person play in a one-on-one workout or whatever that is. So that's a whole nother rant. But for now, hopefully that answers the question. The Hawks have they've definitely been looking at a lot of different players. The lists are very keeping them all, and it is pages and pages of guys who've been in town. But again, 11 guys have already been in Atlanta announced that are first-round candidates, and probably more to come in the coming days. Okay, more questions to come on the podcast. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by Sakara, and filling your best with what you eat. Sakara helps you live a healthy and balanced lifestyle and actually truly enjoy it with delicious, plant-rich, transformational nutrition that builds a foundation for living in your best body. Sakara is a wellness company that's anchored food as medicine, and now they're on a mission to nourish your body through the power of plants. And Sakara gives you the tools that you need to transform your life with their organic, ready-to-eat meal delivery program and functional wellness essentials. They have nutritionally designed, chef-crafted breakfast, lunch, and dinners, and they're made with powerful plant-rich ingredients to help you boost your energy. They support your digestion, they curb your sugar cravings, and they get your skin glowing. Plus, it's all delivered to your door, and it's ready to eat. Sakara's functional plant-rich wellness essentials help you create a body that you absolutely love to live in. And they have their super powder as well as the foundation, their daily supplement packs. And Sakara's products are designed to help you support your wellness goals anytime, anywhere. And right now, Sakara is offering our listeners 20% off on their first order when they use sakara.com/lockedon20 or enter the promo code lockedon20 at checkout. That's Sakara, which is spelled SAKARA.com/lockedon20. 20% off your first order with Sakara. One more time, that is sakara.com/lockedon20. All right, more questions from the listeners, and thank you again for listening to the podcast and also submitting questions. I won't get to all of them. I never do, but keep them coming for sure. shout them out at Locked On Hawks on Twitter, or send them to lockedonhawks@gmail.com for a little bit longer for Twitter, and I will try to answer them either on that platform or on the podcast. Question from Dalvin, who asks, as a Hawks fan, how much should I care about free agency for this season? It's weird to root for a team that does not have cap space after they did for a long time. The short answer is that you should care, but not as much as you used to care about free agency in a lot of ways. Now, in theory, the Hawks do have the full mid-level exception, and I know Chris Kershaw of The Athletic wrote about a bunch of guys that can maybe target with that kind of exception. In practice and in reality, it's kind of hard for me to imagine the Hawks actually using the full MLE because they have so much money committed and the tax concerns, but it would – so basically what I would say is I would lower expectations with regard to outside free agents. The Hawks could reasonably sign a guy or two above the minimum, but not going to be a huge splash. Like some of those higher end names are probably like 4-year MLE candidates. And I can't imagine the Hawks giving that out without other pretty significant roster changes. So I can't project that right now. They're going to have to sign some minimum guys though. Like I know this for a fact, the Hawks are going to have some minimum slots to fill out the roster. And generally speaking, for a team that's trying to win, you want to find some guys who can maybe help you with those slots. Not always easy, but also you have DeLon Wright as a looming free agent from last year's roster, who's going to be more than the minimum, but still a guy that you might want to bring back. So that could all change in the near future. But basically, if you're playing up to the tax line, as the Hawks are salary-wise, free agency is not going to feel like it used to feel. For years, the Hawks had a big cap space. Of course, they spent a ton of money in that one summer on Bogey and on Gallo, and it helped them a lot. They made the conference finals partly as a result of that, especially, the Bogey deals look good for them. Gallo did his part for the most part. But moving forward, with all the money they have committed to Trey and to Herter and to Bogey still for 2 more years, and Collins and Capella, it's maybe 100 down the line, they're not going to have cap space for a while, I don't think. So keep that in mind and adjust your mindset accordingly. Speaking of Bogey, I got 2 questions about this, and I heard it as well, but John Hollinger and Nate Duncan did a podcast recently on their free feed that discussed some potential veteran extension candidates, and they brought up Bogey on that. I think it was Hollinger brought him up. I want to stress this was not reporting from either side. This is just them talking about guys who are eligible for extensions, and Bogey actually is eligible, like Capella was a year ago when he signed that extension kind of out of nowhere. Bogey's kind of a similar standpoint now. He does have 2 years left. The last year is a player option for 23-24, $18 million a year. He's appropriately paid, although there's some knee questions for sure. In fact, there's some rumblings out there that he actually had some sort of procedure in the offseason that was reported somewhere in Europe, and he's probably may not play in Eurobasket for Serbia. Nothing official from the team at all, and you might remember this from last offseason, but the Hawks had 3 or 4 guys that had some sort of offseason cleanup, and the Hawks didn't announce those things at all. They don't really have to in the offseason, so it's kind of a weird situation. But Bogey's knee, let's just say, is a question mark on some level, given that he's the last 2 years has not finished the season at full strength by any means. So that's a question. And even beyond that, what number would you actually want to extend him at to make him more valuable than he is now if you want to trade him, and they might want to trade him in the future? Also, he has to want to take the extension, so you can't just lowball him crazy. And the player option gives him some more leverage as well. So you can't go more than 2 extra years either on that deal, or else you can't trade it for 6 months. And if you're the Hawks, you probably want to have him be trade eligible. Remember this about the Capella deal. He became functionally untradeable last year during the season because of the way they extended him and the timing and all that stuff. So all that said, I think Bogey is at an age where, if you want to tack on another year, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but I don't know why he would do that. I'm not sure if the Hawks want to do that with Herter already signed and some money stuff moving forward. It's just more to say that he is eligible for an extension. It's not impossible. I would bet against it for sure, but he is eligible. Keep that in mind. He's the one guy on the roster, I believe, that is non-rookie extension eligible. Of course, Hunter is rookie extension eligible, which we talked about a number of times already. Probably we'll talk about again. But Bogey is a guy to always keep a half an eye on in the coming days. Next question is actually an extension question as well, but it's in the future. Comes from Dr. Sam, who asks his annual 1 year too early rookie extension question, which is what type of extension will Okongwu be in line for, or at least what would you assume is the market value at this point for Okongwu? First, I love this question, so thanks for asking it. At the same time, it's almost impossible to answer this question right now, which makes it kind of fun, but also kind of frustrating in some ways. I will plug right now a recent very deep dive that I did with Glenn Willis on the podcast about Okongwu, about what he does well, what he can do in the future, his age, all that fun stuff, his trajectory. That's a good resource about Okongwu, so I'm not going to do all that stuff now. But the single biggest factor in Okongwu's market value when it comes to an extension is how much he plays next year, and his role for next year, basically. And we just don't know that right now. That's the hardest thing about this, is that Capella is still on the team. And if they were to trade for someone like Gobert or Ayton, Okongwu's role is not going to grow very much. Even with Capella on the team, there's only so much you can play Okongwu with Capella on the roster. That's just the reality of the situation. Even if Okongwu you believe in, and I do believe in Okongwu, as we talked about a lot on that podcast with Glenn. But if he's playing a lot next summer, let's say they trade Capella for something else that's not a center, and they kind of anoint Okongwu as the main guy at the 5, then you'll learn a lot about Okongwu in the next year, and it gives him a chance to, obviously if that happened, you could pay him, he could be commanding $20 million a year from now in an extension. If that were to all happen well and he plays extremely well, he'll be super young, all that stuff, former top prospect, top, number 6 overall pick, etc. Super fun skill set for the modern game, etc. Or on the downside, if he's still a backup center on the Hawks roster a year from now, it's hard to see him getting a ton of money from the Hawks a year early in an extension because you don't know what you have still. And also you just kind of, blocked on some level. So reasonably projection wise, it's like, again, very, very hard. But a couple of like comparison deals recently for guys that are like interesting players that weren't like 100% proven yet. Like Jakob Poeltl is one. Robert Williams is one from Boston. Okongwu was a higher pick than those guys. Williams had probably played a little bit more and shown a little bit more before he got paid, but had some injury issues, of course. Poeltl, much more of a defensive player, but still a guy who I think is undervalued. Those guys are like in the low 8 figures per season, like 10 to 13 million or so in year 1 with growing salary. Robert Williams is probably going to be a good value on that deal for Boston. They got him before the sort of breakout sort of came for him. And maybe if you're the Hawks, you want to get Okongwu locked up before he gets sort of that full breakout. But those are kind of guys that I would maybe compare to. But again, that's more in the like he hasn't quite broken out yet range. If a year from now he's been starting for half the season and looking awesome, he's going to be signing for a lot more than that. So I'm not sure. It's definitely so tied to who's on the roster that it's really, really hard to answer that. But I do love the question. And it just happens to be that between his pedigree, his talent level, and the situation with it behind Capella at a sort of one position player that he is right now, it's just so hard to answer that. So thank you. And we'll talk about that more in the future. I am very sure about that. Okay. Last question for today before we get out of here, because the finals game is approaching as I'm recording this. It's actually non-basketball, which I appreciate on occasion. So came from Cal, who says, this may not get answered. Well, it is being answered, Cal, so thanks for that. But he says, I'd love to know a non-Hawks answer, like what movies or TV you enjoyed recently. So I don't always do this, but it's a good time to do it. So as I record this again on Friday, June 10th, I saw Top Gun Maverick earlier this week, which was an absolute delight. A+ cinema, really enjoyed that top to bottom. It was everything you would want from a Top Gun Maverick, Top Gun reboot, Tom Cruise in his element, Miles Teller doing Miles Teller things. It was fun. I really enjoyed that movie. That's a recent one. I will, just for other references, I'll watch like Marvel stuff all the time. I love courtroom dramas or sports movies, heist movies, documentaries, big documentary guy. Like Moneyball is awesome, for instance. Ocean's 11, 12, 13 trilogy is like my favorite of all time. I will always text with Robbie Callan for the podcast about those movies, and my father always and brother loves those movies as well. So those are fun for me. I go to the movies, we stay with the movies pretty often before the pandemic. That's kind of my one outlet other than sports to like go do stuff. I'm not a huge like party guy or whatever, but I haven't been a ton recently. I have been going back a little bit more frequently in recent days, including Top Gun Maverick, but I do like the movies when I have time. Of course, I have way too many jobs, famously. I also, again, like I love documentaries about like interesting things. I've been into the sort of docudramas as well recently, like The Dropout with Elizabeth Holmes one with Amanda Seyfried or whatever, however you say her name. The crazy one with Jared Leto and Anne Hathaway about WeWork was interesting to me. So I do watch things that are not sports. I do mostly watch sports, and especially this time of year, watching a lot of NBA draft tape, in addition to live games and baseball and all the other fun stuff that I have to do. But occasionally I will watch movies and TV shows. TV is a long list as well. I have my my go-tos and interesting stuff. Like I like Hacks right now. That's one that I like, etc. So wall to wall when it comes to sports stuff always, but I do try to escape a little bit, and often movies are the way to do that. And if you have any recommendations, I'll take them for sure. I'm not quite a robot. I'm close to a robot sometimes, but not quite all the way there. So hopefully that answers the question, and we'll have many more in the future. All right, that's it for today's podcast. Please, please, please subscribe to the show. My plan for the next 2 weeks basically is to have a couple more guests on about the draft. We have our player capsule stuff wrapping up. We have 3 players left with Glenn Willis and I. We also have probably at least one more solo show between now and the draft where I'll kind of offer my final thoughts on the class, maybe some more mailbag questions, some rankings, some preferences for Atlanta. And just as a reminder, we're in that range now where the Hawks could make a trade before the draft. It's happened before. As a reminder, Torian Prince was traded on June 6th back in the day to Brooklyn. It wasn't official, but it was agreed to and reported on June 6th. The Dwight Howard trade happened before the draft when they sent him to Charlotte. That was a few days before the draft as well. So we're not in the total dead zone anymore. It's not only draft. Probably still the draft is the kickoff when it comes to that. But people have been asking me when trades begin. The short answer is they can happen anytime. But generally, the closer you get to the draft, the more likely a trade actually becomes, both for the Hawks and across the league. So stay tuned. We'll have emergency podcasts when needed, all that fun stuff. But please subscribe to the podcast on your platform of choice. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, especially these days, and leave a comment wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Reviews are always positive, 5-star ratings, and all that fun stuff. Please tell a friend about the show. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland, and we'll see you next week.